Have you ever walked past someone deemed invisible by society? The homeless man on the corner, the cleaner mopping floors after hours, the fisherman with salt-weathered skin? This is a story of Lin Wei, a man the world chose not to see until they couldn't look away. By the end of this journey, you'll understand why wealth isn't always what it seems, and why we must question the systems that determine who deserves our attention. The small fishing village of Tanjung Pinning clung to the southeastern coast of Asia like an afterthought. Dawn had barely broken when Lin Wei's weathered boat pushed away from shore, the wooden hull groaning against a persistent tide. At 54, his hands were maps of his life's labor, calloused, cracked, stained with decades of salt and fish scales. The village elders used to say you could read a person's fortune in their hands. If that were true, Lin Wei's told a story of endless toil with little reward. Another day, another net, he muttered to himself, a ritual phrase passed down from his father, who had inherited it from his father before him. Lin wore the same faded blue shirt he'd worn for the past 3 years, patched in 7 different places. His trousers, once black, had faded to an indistinguishable gray. The other fishermen called him Old Turtle behind his back, not just for his weathered appearance, but for his stubbornness. While others had accepted loan from modern equipment or joined the larger commercial vessels, Lin Wei refused to abandon his traditional methods. Progress isn't always forward, he would say when pressed about his outdated equipment. In truth, the banks had long ago deemed him too high a risk for loans, and the commercial operations wanted younger men with stronger backs. The morning sun climbed higher as Lin Wei dropped his nets in the deeper waters. These were not the fertile grounds of his youth, when the fish practically jumped into the boats. These waters have been depleted by years of commercial overfishing by the massive trawlers that now dominated the horizon, floating factories owned by distant corporations with headquarters in gleaming high-rises. As Lin worked, a luxury yacht cut through the water a kilometer away, its white hull gleaming obscenely against the humble fishing boats. Aboard would be businessmen or politicians. Perhaps both. The lines between them had blurred years ago. Lin had witnessed their numbers increasing, these vessels of excess appearing more frequently as resorts developed along the once pristine coastline. The first time Lin Wei became truly invisible was at the harbor master's office 5 years ago. He had stood there for 20 minutes, waiting to register a complaint about the commercial vessels invading traditional fishing grounds, while officials bustled around him as if he were merely a ghost haunting their modern world. The harbor master is busy with important matters, a young clerk had finally told him, not bothering to look up from his computer. Perhaps come back another time, or better yet, speak with your village representative. The village representative, of course, had been hired by the same conglomerate that owned the commercial fishing fleet. By midday, Lin's catch was meager, a few small grouper, some mackerel, barely enough to cover his fuel costs. He thought about the waters his grandfather had fished, teeming with life, providing not just sustenance but prosperity. He thought about his own son, Min, who had left the village 8 years ago for a factory job in the city, unable to see a future in fishing. "Father, they're building the future without us," Min had said the night before he left. "We can either join them or be forgotten." Lin Wei had not understood then. Now, as he hauled in his nets under the merciless sun, he was beginning to. At the fish market that afternoon, Lin Wei's invisibility was palpably reinforced. The merchants with connections to large distributors were given prime spots, their stalls positioned under the covered section of the market. Lin and the other independent fishermen were relegated to the outer edges, where the sun beat down and fewer customers ventured. "Look at this quality," Lin called out as a well-dressed couple walked past a small display of fish. Fresh this morning, caught with respect. The couple didn't even glance his way, continuing their conversation about property values and the new resort development, without missing a beat. Mrs. Tan, who ran a small soup stall in the market, was one of the few who still saw Lin Wei. She approached his table as the crowds thinned. "The usual?" she asked with a slight smile. "For you, the best of the catch," Lin replied, selecting a fine grouper, one he could have sold for more to a restaurant, had any restaurant buyer bothered to look his way. "You know, Lin," Mrs. Tan said, lowering her voice, "I heard something interesting today about those new buildings going up along the North Shore. Lin Wei's expression hardened. The North Shore had been fishing village land for generations until the government had reclassified it for economic development. I hear they're having trouble with the foundations, she continued. Something about the soil being different than expected. Lin nodded slowly. The elders could have told them. That land was never meant for heavy structures. It shifts with the seasons. Well, apparently they're bringing in some big consultant from overseas. Arriving tomorrow on a private jet. Very important, very secret. As darkness fell, Lin Wei returned to his small house on the outskirts of the village. Once, his home had been centrally located, but as tourism developed, property taxes had forced many fishermen to sell. Lin had refused, but when the road was widened for tour buses, his house had been partially demolished with minimal compensation. Now it stood awkwardly, one wall unnaturally flat where it had been sliced away. Inside, he lit a small lamp and opened a weathered wooden box. Inside lay his most precious possession, not gold or jewels, but a carefully folded document. It was a land deed, written in his grandfather's time, detailing the boundaries of their ancestral claim to a portion of the North Shore. The government officials had dismissed it during the rezoning hearings. Outdated, they called it, superseded by modern land registration systems. But Lin Wei knew the truth. His grandfather had been a careful man who had registered the deed with both local and colonial authorities. There was a reason Lin kept fishing these waters despite the dwindling returns. There was a reason he refused to sell his house despite its awkward position. And there was a reason he still walked to the North Shore every Sunday to place a small offering by the old marker stone. As he ate his simple dinner of rice and a small portion of today's catch, Lin thought about his son. Min sent money when he could, but rarely called. The last time they had spoken, Min had mentioned a new project his factory was working on, components for luxury developments along the coast. Neither father nor son had acknowledged the bitter irony. Lin Wei finished his meal and prepared for bed. Tomorrow would be another day of invisibility, another day of being the ragged fisherman everyone chose not to see. But as he drifted off to sleep, his hand rested on the wooden box containing the deed, and his dreams were filled not with fish or nets, but with the North Shore and the secret it had kept for 3 generations. What Lin Wei couldn't know was that the consultant arriving tomorrow would change everything, and the world that had been so determined not to see him would soon be unable to look away. The consultant arrived in a flurry of expensive cars and security personnel. Lin Wei observed the procession from his boat, just offshore from the troubled construction site. The man was unremarkable in appearance, middle-aged, dressed in a simple but clearly expensive suit, flanked by assistants clutching tablets and phones. What caught Lin's attention was how everyone around the man seemed to orbit him, how the local officials who had never spared Lin a glance now bent forward attentively, hanging on every word. Power, Lin thought, was its own kind of visibility. Later that afternoon, as Lin sorted his meager catch, a young woman approached his table. Unlike the usual market-goers, she didn't avoid eye contact or hurry past the stall. "Excuse me," she said in careful, accented Malay. "Are you Mr. Lin Wei?" Lin looked up, surprised at hearing his name from a stranger. "I am. My name is Mei Zhang. I'm a geological analyst working with Mr. Huang." She gestured toward the North Shore. "I was hoping you might have a few minutes to talk." Lin Wei studied her. She was perhaps 30, with intelligent eyes and a notebook rather than a digital device. Something about her reminded him of his son, the same look of someone caught between worlds. "About fish?" Lin asked carefully. "About land," she replied. "Specifically the North Shore. I understand your family has lived here for generations." An hour later, Lin Wei found himself doing something he never imagined. Sitting in a temporary office at the construction site, across from the consultant himself, Chan Huang. The room fell silent as Lin carefully removed the deed from his wooden box and spread it on the table. "My grandfather was very precise," Lin explained, his weathered finger tracing the handwritten boundaries. He marked these stones himself. Chan Huang studied the document without touching it, then looked up at Lin. "Mr. Lin, do you understand why the foundations are failing on this project?" Lin Wei shrugged. The elders always said the North Shore breathes with the seasons. The land remembers the water that once covered it. Huang nodded slowly. Your elders were correct, though they lacked the scientific terminology. This area sits on a complex system of underwater springs and shifting sediment. Modern engineering can overcome these challenges, but only with proper understanding and planning. And this helps you how? Lin asked bluntly. Your family deed contains information that no modern survey has captured. The boundaries and markers reference points that have been buried or built over. More importantly, your grandfather noted the seasonal changes, the areas where water emerges after heavy rain. This is valuable data. Lin Wei sat back, suddenly uncomfortable. He had expected dismissal. Perhaps even mockery, not this intense interest. The government said my deed was worthless. To a bureaucrat looking to clear obstacles, perhaps. To an engineer trying to build something that will last, it's invaluable. The next morning, Lin didn't go fishing. Instead, he found himself walking the North Shore with Chun Huang, pointing out features that only a lifetime resident would know. By afternoon, drilling equipment had been repositioned based on Lin's knowledge. Mr. Lin, Chin said as they watched the sunset over the construction site, may I ask why you continue fishing? The catches seem hardly worth the effort. Lin gestured to the water. It's what I know, what my family has always done. And if you had other options? Lin Wei studied the man beside him. Everyone has options. Some are just less visible than others. That night, as Lin prepared a simple dinner, there was a knock at his door. Chun Huang stood outside, alone this time. May I come in? He asked. Lin stepped aside, acutely aware of how his humble home must appear to this wealthy man. To his surprise, Chin seemed comfortable, settling at the small table as if he'd visited many such homes before. I've been authorized to offer you a consultant fee, Chin said without preamble, for your local knowledge and historical insights. He named a figure that made Lin pause in the act of pouring tea. It was more than he would make in 3 months of fishing. That's very generous, Lin said carefully. It's merely fair. Your information will save the project millions in the long run. Lin set the teapot down. Why are you really here, Mr. Huang? You could have sent your assistant with a contract. Chun Huang smiled slightly. Perceptive. I am curious about something. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded newspaper clipping, yellow with age. This was in our company archives. I believe the young man in this photo is you. Lin took the paper with surprise. The image showed a group of university students at a protest nearly 30 years earlier. Lin was indeed among them, younger, hair still black, standing slightly apart from the main group. The National Engineering Competition of 1995. Chun continued. Your design for sustainable coastal construction won second place nationally. You disappeared from academic records shortly after. Lin Wei's fingers traced the faces in the photograph. Memories long suppressed came flooding back. The excitement of university, the pride of recognition, the crushing weight of family expectations after his father's sudden death. My father drowned that summer, Lin said softly. I was needed here. You gave up an engineering career to become a fisherman. Lin set the photo down. I became what I needed to become. Chin nodded slowly. Life rarely follows the paths we imagine for ourselves. I understand this better than most. Something in his tone made Lin look up sharply. You speak as if from experience. Because I am. Chin leaned forward. Mr. Lin, what would you say if I told you I grew up in a village not unlike this one? That my father was also a fisherman? Lin studied the man across from him with new interest. I would wonder how you came to be who you are now. Through chance, hard work, and recognizing opportunity when it appeared. Chun gestured to the deed box. Your grandfather was a visionary in his way, documenting what others considered common knowledge. You have that same gift, seeing value where others do not. The conversation lasted well into the night. When Chin finally rose to leave, he left behind not just a consultant contract, but a business card with his personal number. Consider what we discussed, he said at the door. The offer remains open. The following weeks brought dramatic changes to Lin Wei's life. His role as consultant expanded beyond the North Shore project to other developments along the coast. Officials who had once looked through him now greeted him by name. At the market, merchants who had relegated him to the outer edges now saved space under the covered section. Yet Lin continued to take his boat out most mornings, more from habit than necessity. The sea had been his companion too long to abandon it completely. It was on one such morning, nearly a month after Chun Huang's first visit, that Lin noticed something unusual about the currents near the abandoned cove on the far side of the North Shore. While the surface appeared calm, his nets caught differently there, as if pulled by an underwater force. Curious, Lin dove from his boat, something he hadn't done in years. The water was murky at first, but as he swam deeper, he found himself facing a phenomenon he'd never encountered, a powerful underwater spring, pushing upward through a crack in the seabed. Around the spring, the water was remarkably clear, and through that clarity, something glinted. When Lin surfaced, he was holding a stone unlike any he had seen before, crystalline, with strange veins running through it. By afternoon, he had collected several more specimens and brought them to Mei Zhang for identification. Her eyes widened as she examined them. "Where exactly did you find these?" Lin described the location precisely. "Mr. Lin," she said carefully, setting down the stones. "These appear to be raw jade. Very high-quality raw jade. Is that valuable?" Lin asked. May's laugh held a note of disbelief. "Mr. Lin, jade of this quality is extremely valuable. But more importantly, it suggests there may be a significant deposit. On my grandfather's land," Lin said slowly, the implications dawning on him. "Technically, land that was rezoned by the government. May corrected, but given your consultant status and the original deed." She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. That evening, Lin Wei received a call from Chun Huang, who had returned to his headquarters in Singapore. The conversation was brief, but life-changing. "Mr. Lin," Chen said without preamble, "I understand you've made a significant discovery." "News travels fast," Lin replied. "In business, valuable information moves at the speed of light." There was a pause. "I'm prepared to offer you a partnership, not just as a consultant. My company will handle the legal complexities of reclaiming your grandfather's land rights and developing the resource properly. And in return, a 50% share of a venture that, conservatively estimated, could be worth billions." Lin Wei sat down heavily on his worn chair, the phone suddenly seeming very heavy in his hand. "Why would you offer such terms? You have the connections, the lawyers. You could simply take this." 5 years passed like the turning of swift tides. In the gleaming headquarters of Wei Huang Industries, in Singapore, Lin Wei stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office. At 59, he still carried himself with the slightly stooped posture of a man who had spent decades leaning over fishing nets. His hands, despite the expensive moisturizing treatments his assistant insisted upon, remained calloused and weathered, badges of honor he refused to erase. Behind him, a television screen silently displayed financial news. A ticker at the bottom showed Wei Huang stock, continuing its remarkable climb, up another 3% today alone. The business world couldn't get enough of the jade empire that had expanded beyond its initial mining operations into sustainable coastal development, ecotourism, and innovative fishing technologies. "Father, the ministers have arrived," said a familiar voice. Lin turned to see his son Min standing at the door. No longer a factory worker, Min now served as the company's chief innovation officer, his engineering degree finally completed with his father's support. The years had healed much between them. "Tell them I'll be down shortly," Lin replied, turning back to the window. From this height, he could see the harbor where cargo ships carried Wei Huang jade, construction materials, and seafood products to markets worldwide. Somewhere among those distant vessels were the fishermen of Tanjung Pinning, now equipped with boats designed by Min's department. Vessels that improved catch rates while reducing environmental impact. The jade discovery had indeed been worth billions, far more than Chen Huang's initial conservative estimate. The partnership had transformed not just Lin's life, but the entire region. Where once stood haphazard resort developments, now rose carefully planned communities that respected the land's natural features and the local fishing traditions. Lynn straightened his custom-tailored jacket and headed for the elevator. 5 years ago, he would have been stopped at the lobby of a building like this. Now, government ministers waited for his arrival. It was a transformation that still sometimes felt like someone else's life, a sensation that both amused and grounded him. The meeting room fell silent as Lin entered. 3 cabinet ministers rose respectfully, alongside Chen Huang and several company executives. "Mr. Lin, thank you for joining us," said the most senior minister, extending his hand. This same man, Lin recalled with private irony, had dismissed his land claims years ago when he was merely a ragged fisherman. "The pleasure is mine," Lin replied, taking a seat at the head of the table. "I understand we're discussing the expansion of the Coastal Heritage Protection Zone." The minister nodded eagerly. "Your proposal to extend protection to 3 additional fishing villages has received preliminary approval. We're here to discuss implementation details." Lin noticed how the minister emphasized your proposal, though the initiative had originated with the government after months of Wei Huang lobbying. Such was the nature of politics. Everyone wanted association with success. As the meeting progressed, Lin spoke little, allowing Chen and the executive team to handle the technical details. His role had evolved into something more symbolic yet more powerful, the village fisherman whose wisdom now shaped national policy. When he did speak, the room fell silent, all attention riveted on his words. This meeting was merely one of dozens taking place across Asia that day under the Wei Huang banner. The jade deposits had been just the beginning. Lin's insistence on developing the resource sustainably, with benefits flowing back to local communities, had created a corporate model that governments throughout Southeast Asia now courted aggressively. After the ministers departed, Chen remained behind. Now partners for 5 years, the 2 men had developed a shorthand communication that transcended their different backgrounds. They were falling over themselves to agree with everything, Chen observed with amusement. Quite a change from the rezoning hearings. Lin smiled slightly. Money changes how people see you, or whether they see you at all. Speaking of which, Chen continued, sliding a tab across the table. Forbes magazine wants to feature you on next month's cover. The Fisherman King, how Lin Wei built Asia's most innovative resource empire. Lin glanced at the mock-up cover. Without touching it, his own weathered face looked back at him, the photographer having insisted he wear his old blue fishing shirt for authenticity. They're fascinated by the contrast, Chen explained unnecessarily. The humble origins, the overnight billions. People love these stories. Because they believe they're about luck, Lin replied. Not about systems that make some people invisible until they have something others want. Chen nodded thoughtfully. Will you do the interview? Lin considered the question. 5 years ago, his instinct would have been to refuse, to protect his privacy, to avoid drawing attention. But he had learned that visibility, properly managed, was power, and power, properly applied, could change the systems themselves. Yes, he decided, but I want to speak about the Coastal Heritage Initiative, and I want the photographer to include the village elders in the shoot. That evening, Lin's private helicopter carried him not to his luxury home on Singapore's exclusive Sentosa Island, but to the place he still thought of as home, Tanjung Pinang. The village had changed dramatically, yet remained essentially the same. New infrastructure blended with traditional architecture. The fishing fleet included both modern vessels and classic wooden boats. The market had been rebuilt with proper facilities, while maintaining its original character. Lin's original house remained exactly as it had been, though the surrounding properties had been purchased and converted into a community center and training facility for young fishermen. He maintained a small apartment above the center where he stayed during his frequent visits. As he walked through the evening market, Lin was neither invisible nor treated with uncomfortable deference. Here, where people had known him all his life, he was granted a precious gift, being seen for who he was, not what he owned. Lin, come try this new soup recipe, called Mrs. Tan from her stall, now expanded into a proper restaurant, but still personally run by the elderly woman. Lin smiled and made his way over. Mrs. Tan had refused all offers to franchise her restaurant concept across Asia, preferring to cook every pot herself. Lin respected her choice. Not everyone wanted their life transformed by sudden wealth. "How are the big shots in Singapore?" she asked as she ladled soup into a bowl. "Still impressed with themselves?" "More impressed with stock prices," Lin replied, accepting the bowl gratefully. Mrs. Tan snorted, as if numbers on a screen matter more than this. She gestured to the marketplace around them, vibrant with life. After dinner, Lin walked to the North Shore, where it all began. The troubled construction site of 5 years ago had been replaced by a cultural center that documented the region's fishing heritage. Behind it, the carefully regulated jade mining operation continued, using innovative methods developed by Lin's company that minimized environmental impact. At the center's entrance stood the original marker stone from his grandfather's deed, now protected by a simple glass case. Lin placed his hand on the glass, feeling a connection that transcended time and transformation. A group of school children on a late educational tour passed by, their teacher explaining the history of the site. Lin stepped back, content to observe unrecognized. "That's where they found the jade that made Mr. Lin rich," the teacher was saying, pointing to the shore. A small boy raised his hand. "Was he always rich?" "No," the teacher replied. "He was a fisherman, just like many of your parents. But he knew the land and sea better than anyone." "Is he still alive?" asked another child. "Very much so. He runs one of the biggest companies in Asia now." The children looked suitably impressed. Lin smiled to himself, wondering what they would make of the truth, that the richest man in the room was the unnoticed older gentleman in the simple clothes. Later that night, Lin sat on the small balcony of his apartment, looking out over the water. His phone buzzed with a message from Chun. "Financial Times confirms Wei Huang market cap now makes you officially the richest individual in Asia." Lin set the phone down without replying. The title meant little to him personally, though he understood its strategic value. Visibility at that level opened doors that had once been firmly closed, allowed conversations that would have been impossible before. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Opening it, he found a young woman in her 20s, dressed in the uniform of Wei Huang's Fishery Management Division. "Mr. Lin, I'm sorry to disturb you," she said nervously. "My name is Anya. I'm new to the data collection team." "How can I help you, Anya?" Lin asked kindly. "Our equipment is showing unusual readings in the Eastern Cove, but none of the senior staff are available. I saw your light was on." She trailed off, clearly realizing the impropriety of disturbing the company founder with such a matter. Lin surprised her by reaching for his jacket. "Show me the readings." 20 minutes later, they stood on the research vessel, examining data on underwater currents. Lin studied the patterns with interest. "It's probably nothing important," Anya said apologetically. "I shouldn't have bothered you." "Knowledge is never a bother," Lin replied. "Besides, these patterns remind me of something I noticed years ago, just before we discovered the jade deposits." Anya's eyes widened. "Really? Should I alert the geological team?" Lin shook his head. "Tomorrow is soon enough. For now, just record everything carefully." He looked out over the dark water, remembering another night spent on a boat, worried about the next day's catch. "Sir," Anya said hesitantly, "may I ask you something personal?" Lin nodded. "The company orientation included your story about how you were just a simple fisherman before the jade discovery. Is it strange going from that life to—" She gestured vaguely. "All this?" Lin considered her question seriously. "The strangest part," he said finally, "is how differently people treat you based on what they think you're worth. When I was just a fisherman, officials wouldn't look me in the eye. The same men now laugh at my mildest jokes. That must feel good, though," Anya ventured, proving them wrong. "It might, if that were the point," Lin replied. "But the jade didn't make me different or better. It just made me visible to a system that measures human value by wealth." He turned to face her directly. "Remember this, Anya. In our company, we see people first. Their knowledge, their potential, their humanity, not their position or possessions." The young woman nodded slowly, absorbing his words. The next morning, Lin rose before dawn. Old habits died hard. Instead of attending the executive breakfast scheduled at the cultural center, he quietly made his way to the harbor. There, he found his original fishing boat, maintained in working condition as a personal indulgence. Within an hour, Lin Wei, the richest man in Asia, the subject of business school case studies, the power broker courted by governments, was alone on the water, dropping nets as the sun rose over the horizon. His expensive watch and phone lay locked in a drawer back at the apartment. Out here, there were no stock tickers, no ministers seeking approval, no Forbes photographers trying to capture his authentic essence. There was only the sea, the sky, and the work that had defined his life long before Jade or Billions entered the picture. As the morning progressed, several other fishing boats appeared nearby. The fishermen waved casually to Lin, treating him as one of their own, a courtesy extended nowhere else in his new life. One boat pulled alongside, the captain calling out about a school of fish spotted in the western shallows. Lin waved in thanks and adjusted his course accordingly. This simple exchange, information freely shared between equals, felt more genuine than all the business intelligence reports that crossed his desk daily. By midday, Lin's nets held a respectable catch. He headed back to shore, where a small crowd had gathered, company executives searching frantically for their missing founder, who was scheduled to address international investors in an hour. As his boat approached the dock, Lin could see his son Min at the forefront, half worried, half exasperated. Beside him stood Chen Huang, who alone seemed unsurprised and even slightly amused by the situation. "Father," Min called as the boat drew closer. "The investors are waiting. We've been looking everywhere." Lin secured his boat with practiced ease, then began unloading his catch as if no one were waiting. The executives watched in confused silence as Asia's wealthiest man, dressed in old fishing clothes now soaked with seawater and fish scales, methodically sorted his morning's work. Finally, Chen stepped forward. "Good catch?" he asked conversationally. "Better than yesterday," Lin replied with a slight smile. "Not as good as tomorrow might be." Chen nodded as if this explained everything. "The helicopter is ready whenever you are. Perhaps a quick change of clothes first." Lin handed his fish to a stunned executive assistant. "Distribute these to the village elders," he instructed, then turned to his waiting entourage. "Now, let's go talk about quarterly projections and market expansion." As the helicopter lifted off 30 minutes later, Lin, now dressed in an impeccable suit, looked down at the village and the fishing boats dotting the harbor. From this height, his own vessel was indistinguishable from the others. "You know," Chen remarked beside him, "most billionaires buy yachts, not take out fishing boats before dawn." Lin smiled. "Most billionaires are trying to escape their past. I'm trying to remember mine." The helicopter banked towards Singapore and the waiting investors. Below, the village that had once rendered Lin Wei invisible now proudly claimed him as their own, not because of his wealth, but because of what he had done with it. And as Asia's financial papers heralded the meteoric rise of the fisherman billionaire, Lin himself understood a truth few would ever grasp. True wealth wasn't measured by what you accumulated, but by remaining visible to yourself, even when the world had decided what it wanted to see. This story reminds us that we all have the power to see people for who they truly are, not what society labels them as. Next time you pass someone society as deemed invisible, remember Lin Wei. What hidden knowledge, what untapped potential walks past us daily because we've been trained to value the wrong things. The question isn't just who we fail to see, but what that blindness costs us all.